Every console generation leaves behind a trail of forgotten curiosities, games that never broke into the mainstream but still stand as fascinating artifacts of their time. The PlayStation 2, with its massive library and global dominance, has more than a few of those oddities tucked away in its catalog. One such game is Vampire Panic, released in 2004 exclusively in Japan. If you weren't importing games or obsessively tracking every survival horror release of the era, chances are you missed it entirely. But digging into Vampire Panic is like opening a time capsule of early 2000s experimentation, a title that borrows heavily from its peers, stumbles under its own ambitions, yet still manages to charm through its moody setting and strange design choices. What drew me to Vampire Panic wasn't just its rarity or obscurity, but how much it represents that specific moment in gaming history when developers were still figuring out what survival horror could be. The PS2 was already hosting titans like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and Onimusha, games that blended cinematic atmosphere with gameplay innovations. Vampire Panic, by comparison, feels like a scrappy middleweight punching above its weight class with a mix of gothic horror, stage-like presentation, and multi-character storytelling. It doesn't always succeed, but its failures are just as revealing as its successes. At first glance, Vampire Panic sets up like many of its horror contemporaries: a cursed European village, a spreading plague of vampirism, and a handful of unlikely heroes forced into the thick of it. But instead of focusing on one singular protagonist, the game splits its narrative among three playable characters: a stern priest, a rugged vampire hunter, and a young woman caught in the chaos. This ensemble cast was more than just a gimmick. It gave the story a rotating lens, showing the crisis from different angles. Each character had unique skills, perspectives, and motivations, which created a dynamic that, while rough around the edges, was surprisingly ambitious for its time. Atmosphere played a major role in this ambition. Unlike the bombast of Devil May Cry or the heavy dread of Silent Hill, Vampire Panic leaned into something quieter, almost theatrical. The game's gothic architecture, candlelit interiors, and eerie village settings felt like they could have been ripped from a stage play or a Hammer horror film. Even when the combat turned clunky or animations looked stiff, the moodiness of the environments carried a lot of weight. It wasn't always scary in a traditional sense. There were few jump scares or grotesque body horror moments, but it managed to establish an unsettling rhythm where every corridor felt like a stage awaiting its next grim scene. Yet, this ambition was often undercut by its mechanics. Controls were stiff, combat felt repetitive, and the flow of encounters sometimes broke the tension instead of heightening it. You could see the game gasping for the same slow burn tension that Resident Evil perfected, but more often than not, it tripped over itself. Still, this flawed execution gives Vampire Panic its identity. It's a game that aimed for something much greater than the sum of its parts, even if the parts didn't quite fit together. Survival horror in the early 2000s was a crowded field, and Vampire Panic clearly wore its influences on its sleeve. The fixed camera angles? Straight from Resident Evil. The gothic medieval flair? Shades of Onimusha with a vampire twist. The resource management and slow, deliberate pacing? A genre staple at the time. To some, this might make Vampire Panic feel like a knockoff, a title content to mimic rather than innovate, but to dismiss it as just an imitation would be missing what makes it stand out. One of its most interesting innovations was its use of multiple perspectives. Where Resident Evil 2 had Claire and Leon's branching campaigns, Vampire Panic pushed further by intertwining three characters into the same narrative, making the story feel more layered even if the writing itself wasn't always strong. Switching perspectives gave the game game a sense of scope, like the entire village was under siege and no single character could carry the burden alone. This fragmented narrative structure foreshadowed what other games, years later, would refine into a more polished experience. The combat, however, was where Vampire Panic stumbled the hardest. While the idea of mixing melee weapons, firearms, and supernatural powers was solid on paper, in practice it often felt clumsy. Enemy AI was predictable, hit detection was inconsistent, and encounters dragged longer than they needed to. Yet even here, there was an odd charm. Unlike polished action titles of the time, the clunkiness gave combat a frantic, improvisational feel. You weren't stylishly cutting down waves of enemies, you were scraping by, swinging wildly, and praying your items would hold out. In some ways, this made the game feel more desperate, more in line with its survival horror roots, even when it wasn't intentional. Looking back now, Vampire Panic feels like a game that was doomed to obscurity before it even released. By launching only in Japan, it denied itself the chance to reach Western audiences who were hungry for anything in the survival horror genre. This regional exclusivity is part of why it remains so little known, but also why it carries a certain mystique among collectors and fans of the era. It's one of those hidden gems people whisper about not because it's perfect, but because it represents a road not taken, a title that could have grown into something special with a bit more polish and wider exposure. The potential for a cult following is obvious in retrospect. Its gothic aesthetic, multi-character structure, and vampire-centric lore gave it personality to stand apart, at least conceptually. Had it received localization, patches of refinement, or even a sequel, Vampire Panic might have carved a niche similar to mid-tier horror franchises like Fatal Frame. Instead, it became one of many PS2 titles swallowed by time, remembered only by enthusiasts digging through the console's vast library. What I find most compelling about Vampire Panic today is that it highlights the importance of these almost games. They may not be masterpieces, but they reveal the boundaries of experimentation in their era. Every rough edge, every unrefined system, every missed opportunity tells us something about where the genre was headed. In this way, Vampire Panic isn't just a forgotten curiosity. It's a piece of the survival horror puzzle, showing us how developers wrestled with the genre's identity in a time of transition. Vampire Panic will never be remembered alongside the giants of survival horror. It doesn't have the haunting psychological terror of Silent Hill, the polish of Resident Evil, or the stylish flair of Devil May Cry, but it doesn't need to. What makes it fascinating is its ambition, the way it tried to weave together a multi-perspective story, drench players in gothic atmosphere, and push against the conventions of its peers, even if it stumbled along the way. For fans of the genre, seeking out Vampire Panic is like opening a window into a parallel timeline of survival horror, a glimpse of what could have been had it received the chance to grow. It's flawed. It's clunky, but it's also uniquely captivating in its earnestness. And in a generation as vast as the PS2's, maybe that's enough. Sometimes the most interesting games aren't the ones that succeeded, but the ones that dared to fail in style.